The snow fell in soft, silent drifts as I pulled my coat tighter against the cold, the darkened streets illuminated by the dim glow of flickering street lamps. It was Christmas morning, but the town was unusually quiet. Everyone was home, warm and content, sharing the magic of the season with family. Everyone except me. I'd been desperate, darting from shop to shop on Christmas Eve, searching for the perfect gift for Emily, my 7-year-old daughter. Work had swallowed most of my time this year, and the guilt of neglect gnawed at me. She'd been asking for something special, something no one else had, and I was determined to make this holiday unforgettable. That's when I saw it, an antique store I had never noticed before. The windows were fogged over, and its sign, a weathered wooden plank hanging askew, read, "Whispering Treasures." It wasn't on any of the streets I usually walked, and yet here it was, its faint, golden light spilling into the snow. The bell above the door jingled softly as I stepped inside, the warmth of the shop wrapping around me like a blanket. The air smelled of aged wood and cinnamon, a strangely comforting combination. Shelves overflowed with trinkets, vintage toys, and oddities that seemed plucked from another time. Behind the counter stood an elderly man, his face deeply lined but his eyes sharp and piercing. He wore an old-fashioned waistcoat, his gnarled hands folded neatly on the counter. "Looking for something special?" he asked, his voice gravelly yet melodic. "Actually, yes," I replied, brushing snow from my sleeves. "A gift for my daughter. Something unique." His thin lips curved into a smile. "Ah, I have just the thing." He stepped out from behind the counter and moved with surprising swiftness to a dusty display case. Inside was a music box, unlike anything I had ever seen. Its base was carved from dark mahogany, intricate patterns etched into its surface, and its lid was a pane of frosted glass, through which tiny figures danced around a winter village scene. "This," he said, lifting it gently and placing it in my hands, "is very rare. One of a kind. Perfect for your little girl." I wound the key on its side, and a hauntingly beautiful melody filled the room, delicate and sad. The figures inside twirled gracefully, their movements almost too fluid for mere mechanisms. "It's perfect," I whispered, mesmerized. As I reached for my wallet, the old man added, "And for Emily, I'll include this." From behind the counter, he produced a doll. It was dressed in a red velvet dress, its porcelain face framed by dark, curly hair. Its glass eyes seemed almost too real, glinting in the light like shards of ice. "It's lovely," I said hesitantly, unsettled by how lifelike it appeared. "A gift from the heart," he said, handing it to me. "No charge." I didn't argue. Something about his expression told me it was best not to. I thanked him, paid for the music box, and left the store. Back home, the house was warm, the Christmas tree glowing with colored lights. Emily was already awake, her face lighting up when she saw the music box. "It's beautiful, Daddy," she exclaimed, hugging me tightly. "And this came with it," I said, handing her the doll. Emily's smile faltered for a moment as she stared at it, her little brows knitting together. "Do you like her?" I asked, suddenly unsure. "Yes," she said after a pause. "She's pretty." But her voice lacked the enthusiasm I'd hoped for. We spent the rest of the morning opening presents and eating breakfast, the music box playing softly in the background. The melody was enchanting, yet something about it left a strange hollowness in the air, as though the music itself carried a hint of sorrow. That night, after Emily had gone to bed, I found the doll sitting on the living room couch. "I thought she took this to her room," I murmured to myself. Shrugging, I carried it upstairs and placed it next to her other toys. When I woke the next morning, the doll was back on the couch. "Emily?" I called as I made my way to the kitchen. "Did you leave your doll down here again?" Emily looked up from her cereal, shaking her head. "No, Daddy. I left her in my toy box." The back of my neck prickled, but I brushed it off. Maybe she'd forgotten. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences multiplied. The music box would start playing by itself, the haunting tune drifting through the house at odd hours. The doll would appear in different places, even though Emily swore she wasn't moving it. One night, I found it perched on the stairs, its glassy eyes staring straight at me. My stomach twisted as I picked it up, its porcelain face cold to the touch. That was when Emily started talking about the other girl. "She visits me at night," Emily said casually as we decorated cookies. "What other girl?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even. "The one who plays with my doll," she said, sprinkling sugar onto a reindeer-shaped cookie. "She likes the music box too." A cold shiver ran down my spine. "Emily," I said, forcing a smile, "there's no other girl. You know that, right?" She looked up at me, her big, innocent eyes filled with confusion. "But she's here every night, Daddy. She says this was her house a long time ago." My hands froze mid-motion. "What else does she say?" Emily shrugged. "That she likes her toys back. But don't worry. She says I can borrow them for now." That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, listening for any sound, any creak of the floorboards. Around midnight, the music box began to play. I shot out of bed and rushed to Emily's room, my heart pounding. The music was louder than ever, the tune distorted and shrill. Emily was sitting up in bed, the doll clutched in her arms, staring at the music box as it spun wildly. "Emily, what are you doing?" I demanded, reaching to grab the doll. "She's here," Emily whispered, her eyes fixed on the corner of the room. I turned, and the shadows seemed to ripple, as though something was moving just out of sight. The air grew cold, and a faint voice, no louder than a breath, whispered, "Mine." The single word froze me in place. The air felt dense, suffocating, as though the room had been swallowed by an unseen presence. My eyes scanned the shadows, straining to see what Emily was staring at so intently, but there was nothing. "Emily," I said, my voice trembling, "come here. Now." She didn't move. The doll was clutched tightly in her small hands, her knuckles pale against the crimson velvet of its dress. "She's mad," Emily said softly, her voice strangely calm. "Mad? What do you mean?" I whispered, my throat dry. "She doesn't like that you're touching her things." Before I could respond, the music box's melody surged, a discordant crescendo that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. The figures inside spun wildly, their tiny painted faces blurring as they twisted faster than they should have been able to. The frosted glass of the lid cracked with a sharp pop. I rushed forward, grabbed Emily, and carried her out of the room. The doll tumbled from her hands, landing with a soft thud on the floor, but I didn't stop. I didn't dare look back. We spent the night in my room, Emily curled against me, her small body trembling. I kept the door locked and the bedside lamp on, but sleep didn't come. Every now and then, I thought I heard the faint strains of the music box, like a taunt drifting through the stillness of the house. The next morning, I went back into Emily's room, determined to put an end to this madness. The doll was sitting upright in the middle of the floor, its lifeless eyes fixed on the doorway. I bent down, hesitating for only a moment, and grabbed it. Its porcelain face felt colder than ice, almost burning against my skin. For an instant, I thought I saw its mouth curve into a faint smirk, but I dismissed it as my imagination running wild. I took the doll and the music box out to the garage and stuffed them into an old cardboard box. I taped it shut, then shoved it onto the highest shelf, far out of reach. When I returned to the house, Emily was sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale. "She's mad at you," she said without looking up. "Who, Emily?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "The girl. She says you can't take her things. She says they belong to her." "Emily, listen to me," I said firmly, crouching to her level. "There is no girl. It's just a doll and a music box. That's all." Emily's lip quivered, but she nodded. "Okay, Daddy." I wanted to believe that was the end of it. But the worst was yet to come. That night, I woke to the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, they echoed in the hallway outside my room. I sat up, my heart hammering. Emily was asleep beside me, her soft breath steady. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice hoarse. There was no response, just an oppressive silence. Then, the doorknob began to turn. I scrambled out of bed, grabbing the first thing I could find, a heavy lamp from the bedside table, and stood ready as the door creaked open. No one was there. But the doll was, sitting in the hallway. I stared at it, my mind racing. I had locked it in the garage. How was it here? The air grew colder, and then I heard it, a soft, mournful cry, like that of a child. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once, weaving through the stillness like smoke. "Please," the voice whispered, barely audible. I backed into the room, slamming the door shut and locking it. The next day, I decided I couldn't stay in the house any longer. Whatever was happening, it wasn't something I could face alone. I called my sister, Lisa, and asked if we could stay with her for a few days. She didn't ask questions, just told me to pack a bag and come over. As I loaded the car, I caught sight of the box in the garage. It was still sealed, untouched. A chill ran down my spine. If the doll had been locked in there, then how? I didn't want to think about it. Emily seemed relieved when I told her we were leaving, but as we drove away, she glanced back at the house, her small face etched with worry. "She's following us," she whispered. At Lisa's house, things were calm at first. Emily played with her cousins, and for the first time in days, I felt a sense of peace. That night, as I settled into the guest room, Emily came to me with a troubled look. "Daddy," she said, clutching my hand, I heard her again. "She's not here, Emily," I said, though I wasn't sure if I believed it myself. "We left her behind." Emily shook her head. "She said she'll always find me." I held her close, trying to reassure her, but the pit in my stomach only deepened. At around 3 a.m., I woke to a familiar sound, the music box. It was faint but unmistakable, its haunting melody weaving through the quiet of the house. I sat up, my pulse racing. The music was coming from Emily's room. I bolted down the hallway and threw open the door. Emily was sitting on the bed, her eyes wide with fear. The doll was in her lap, and the music box sat on the dresser, spinning wildly. "She's here," Emily whispered. Suddenly, the room grew icy, and the lights flickered. A shadow moved across the wall, taking the shape of a small girl. "Give them back," the voice demanded, louder now, filled with anger and sorrow. I grabbed the doll and the music box, not caring about the searing cold that burned my hands, and ran out of the room. "Daddy!" Emily cried, but I didn't stop. I threw the toys into the fireplace in the living room, grabbed a lighter, and set them ablaze. The music box let out a high-pitched wail, the melody twisting into a horrific cacophony as the flames consumed it. The doll's porcelain face cracked, and from within, a low, guttural scream erupted, fading into nothing as the fire reduced it to ash. The air grew still. When I turned, Emily was standing in the doorway, her eyes wide. "Is she gone?" she asked softly. I knelt down and hugged her tightly. "Yes, sweetie. She's gone." But as we stood there in the quiet of the living room, I couldn't shake the feeling that the girl's sorrow hadn't been silenced. It had only been passed on. The chill in the room seemed to thicken, the whispered word, "mine," lingering in the air like a ghostly echo. My heart raced as I pulled Emily into my arms. She clutched the doll tightly, her little body trembling against me. "Emily," I whispered, my voice tight with fear, "it's going to be okay." But even as I said it, I wasn't sure I believed it. The music box stopped abruptly, the silence it left behind almost deafening. I turned on every light in her room, scanning the corners for anything out of the ordinary, but there was nothing, just shadows retreating from the glow. "Who's here?" I asked softly, kneeling in front of her. She looked at me with wide, solemn eyes. "The girl," she said. "She's mad because we're not sharing." "Sharing what?" "Her toys," Emily said simply. I didn't know how to respond. My logical mind told me this was just the imagination of a child, fueled by the strange ambience of the music box and the eeriness of the doll. But deep down, I felt it, the heavy, oppressive presence of something unseen. "I'm going to put the doll and the music box away for now," I said. Emily's face crumpled. "No. She'll be madder if you take them." "I'll make sure everything's fine," I assured her, though my voice wavered. "You don't have to worry." She didn't resist as I gently took the doll from her arms. Its glassy eyes seemed to glint in the warm light, as if mocking my attempt to reclaim control. I locked the music box and the doll in an old storage chest in the basement. The moment the lid shut, it felt like the atmosphere in the house lightened, as though the oppressive weight had lifted. I returned to Emily's room, where she had finally fallen asleep, and sat by her side until dawn. But the relief didn't last. The next morning, the music box was back on the living room coffee table, its lid open, though I had locked it tightly the night before. Emily found the doll sitting on the stairs, its head tilted slightly, as if watching us. I nearly dropped my coffee mug when I saw it. "Who put this here?" I snapped, the panic rising in my voice. Emily looked at me, her expression oddly calm. "She did." I didn't know what to believe. The rational part of me tried to explain it away. Maybe I hadn't locked the chest properly, or maybe Emily had retrieved the toys and didn't want to admit it. But there was something in her eyes, something quiet and knowing, that made me doubt those explanations. That evening, as Emily colored at the dining table, I decided to confront the source of the problem. I grabbed the music box and the doll, determined to return them to the antique store. The snow had picked up, swirling violently in the icy wind, but I didn't care. I drove through the darkened streets, my breath fogging up the windshield, until I reached the place where the store had been. It wasn't there. I slammed on the brakes, staring at the empty lot. There was no sign of whispering treasures, no flickering golden light, no worn wooden sign. Just snow-covered ground and silence. I stepped out of the car, clutching the toys, my mind racing. Had I imagined the whole thing? Had I wandered into some kind of seasonal pop-up store that had vanished overnight? The toys felt heavier in my hands, as though they were protesting my attempt to rid myself of them. Defeated, I climbed back into the car and drove home, my chest tightening with dread. That night, the house seemed alive with sound, soft creaks of the floorboards, faint whispers that I couldn't quite make out, and the occasional haunting chime of the music box playing a single, mournful note. I didn't sleep. Around 3 a.m., I heard Emily giggling. The sound jolted me upright. I rushed to her room, my heart pounding, and froze in the doorway. Emily was sitting on the floor, the doll in her lap, the music box spinning wildly beside her. Her face was lit with an expression of pure delight, her laughter echoing through the room. "Emily," I said, my voice shaking, "what are you doing?" She looked up at me, her eyes wide and glassy. "We're playing," she said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I stepped into the room, my hands trembling as I reached for the doll. But as my fingers brushed its porcelain face, the room went ice cold. The lights flickered, and a sudden gust of wind whipped through the room, though the windows were shut tight. The music box grew louder, its distorted tune now almost unbearable. "Leave her alone!" Emily screamed, clutching the doll tighter. The door slammed shut behind me, and I felt a force, something invisible, pushing me back. My mind reeled as the shadows in the room seemed to writhe, forming the faint outline of a small figure near Emily. "Emily, get away from her!" I shouted, but my voice was swallowed by the howling wind. The figure turned to me, its form growing clearer. It was a girl, no older than Emily, her features pale and ghostly, her eyes hollow and filled with sorrow. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words came as a harsh, guttural wail. I lunged forward, grabbing Emily and pulling her into my arms. The moment I touched her, the wind ceased, the light steadied, and the room fell deathly silent. The doll lay on the floor, its head turned toward us, its painted lips twisted into what looked like a cruel smile. The next day, I called a local historian, desperate to make sense of what was happening. After hours of research, we found a chilling story buried in the town's archives. Decades ago, on a snowy Christmas day, a little girl named Clara had died in that very house. She had been given a music box and a doll, her most treasured possessions, but a fire had consumed her room before she could enjoy them. The toys had been salvaged from the wreckage, but Clara's spirit was said to linger, forever tied to what she had lost. My blood ran cold as I realized the truth. The music box and the doll weren't just toys, they were anchors, binding Clara to our world. And now, she wanted them back. The revelation about Clara left me shaken. A child's restless spirit tied to her belongings, a music box and a doll. I couldn't deny the pattern, the sudden appearance of the store, the peculiar behavior of the toys, and Emily's insistence that the girl visited her. Clara wasn't just a figment of imagination. She was here, in my house, and she wasn't leaving. But the bigger question gnawed at me: what did Clara want? That night, I decided to take a stand. I couldn't allow whatever this was to hurt Emily. After she went to bed, I retrieved the music box and doll from her room and brought them into the living room. I placed them on the coffee table, their presence unnerving in the dim light. The music box sat still, its key unwound. The doll stared at me, its porcelain face unreadable, its eyes glinting in the faint glow of the fireplace. I sat across from them, gripping the edge of the couch. "Clara," I said aloud, my voice trembling, "if you're here, I need to understand what you want. You can't hurt my daughter." The air grew heavy, pressing against my chest like an invisible weight. The fire flickered, its warm light dimming until it barely illuminated the room. Then, the music box began to play. The melody was slow and mournful, each note striking a chord deep within me. The lid opened on its own, the tiny figures inside twirling with unnatural grace. A chill ran down my spine as I noticed the reflection in the glass lid. Emily's toys were arranged in a neat circle around the music box. I hadn't placed them there. The doll toppled over with a soft thud, and the music stopped abruptly. The silence was suffocating. "Clara?" I whispered again. A faint outline began to form in the corner of the room, just beyond the reach of the firelight. It was her, a small girl in a soot-streaked dress, her hair tangled, her eyes dark and hollow. She didn't move, but I felt her presence fill the room, cold and unrelenting. "Why are you here?" I asked, my voice shaking. Her gaze flicked to the music box, then to the doll. Slowly, she raised a translucent hand and pointed toward the stairs. Toward Emily's room. "No," I said, standing. "You can't have her. She's not yours." Clara's form flickered, and the music box began to play again, this time faster, the melody frantic and dissonant. The doll rolled across the table and landed upright, its head tilting toward me in what felt like a deliberate gesture. "Tell me what you want," I shouted, the words echoing through the empty house. For a moment, everything was still. Then, Clara's voice came, soft and strained, like wine through cracked windows. "Home." The next morning, I called the historian again, desperate for guidance. She listened intently as I recounted the events of the night, her tone growing increasingly somber. "You said the toys were salvaged from the fire?" she asked. "Yes." "Then they may still be tied to her," she explained. "Objects like that, especially ones a child loved deeply, can become anchors. If Clara wants to go home, she might mean the place where she died." I swallowed hard, dread coiling in my stomach. "But that house was rebuilt decades ago. Our house is standing on the same spot." "Then the connection is here," she said. "You may need to return the toys to the exact place where the fire happened." And, her voice faltered. "What?" I pressed. "You might need to let her finish what was left undone." That night, I told Emily everything, or at least as much as I could without scaring her. I explained that Clara was a little girl who had lived in our house a long time ago and that she needed help. "Does that mean she'll stop being mad?" Emily asked. "I think so," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure. Together, we carried the music box and the doll into the basement. The space was cold and damp, its concrete floor cracked with age. I had never liked coming down here, the air always felt too still, too watchful. "This is where her room would have been," I said, gesturing to the far corner. Emily held the doll tightly, her face pale but determined. "Will she be happy now?" "I hope so," I said, placing the music box on the floor. As soon as it touched the ground, the room seemed to shift. The shadows deepened, the temperature plummeted, and the faint smell of smoke filled the air. Emily gasped, clutching my hand. Clara appeared, her ghostly form more solid than ever. She stepped forward slowly, her hollow eyes fixed on the music box. The haunting melody began to play on its own, the lid creaking open as the figures danced. The doll slipped from Emily's arms, landing upright at Clara's feet. "Clara," I said softly, "this is your home. Your toys. You don't have to stay here anymore. You can rest." For a moment, she didn't move. Then, she knelt beside the music box, her translucent fingers brushing the tiny figures inside. Her expression softened, and for the first time, she looked like a little girl, not a restless spirit. The doll's head turned slowly toward her, its painted lips curving into a serene smile. A soft glow enveloped Clara, growing brighter until it filled the room. Emily and I shielded our eyes, and when the light faded, Clara was gone. The music box had stopped playing. The doll lay on its side, its lifeless gaze staring blankly at the ceiling. We buried the toys in the backyard the next day, marking the spot with a small wooden cross. Emily said goodbye to Clara, leaving a drawing she'd made of the two of them together. The house felt lighter after that. The strange sound ceased, the oppressive cold dissipated, and the music box never played again. Life returned to normal, but every Christmas, Emily leaves a small toy under the tree. "Just in case she wants to visit," she says with a smile. And though I don't believe Clara will return, I still find myself looking at the shadows, half expecting to see a little girl watching over her toys.